Hello and welcome at the World in Focus.
Dzień dobry, serdecznie witamy na Świecie pod lupą.
Świat pod lupą to seria debat o aktualnych wyzwaniach polityki międzynarodowej.
Wraz z wybitnymi ekspertami i ekspertkami przyjrzymy się, co czeka Europę i Polskę w zmieniającym się świecie.
Więcej na naszej stronie internetowej.
A teraz zapraszamy na kolejną dyskusję.
Wchodzimy.
Dzień dobry Państwu, witamy na kolejnej debacie Świata pod
Good
lupą.
afternoon. Welcome to yet another debate of the World in Focus, Warsaw International Gatherings. For the fifth time, we've met to talk about politics, to take it in focus, to look at social changes. The Heinrich Böll Foundation office in Warsaw has been organizing this conference, these meetings for the past 5 years, together with the ECFR, the Warsaw office. Today's topic is the European culture of protest, thus fighting for the so-called better tomorrow, unite across borders. Whether people on both sides of the globe are protesting against one and the same thing, is it really possible? COVID has shown us how horrible the implications of a pandemic might be. I would like to welcome very warmly our guests, Elżbieta Korolczuk, Jacek, Kołtan, and Alberto Alemanno. Good afternoon. My name is Joanna Stolarek, and I'm the head of the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Warsaw. And I would like to start with Elżbieta Korolczuk, who works at the Södertörn University in Stockholm and the American Studies Center at the University of Warsaw. In her research, she deals with the issues of gender, social movements, and civil society. We can see big anti-COVID protests, for instance, in Germany. We can see those protests in Poland as well, in the Czech Republic, for instance. What unites people that seem to be totally different? They're anti-COVID, neo-Nazis, people who seem to be fighting for better tomorrow. Why do extremely different options meet in the street fighting for one good? What's the foundation for this? Well, thank you for inviting me, first of all, and for hosting this debate in such difficult circumstances. And now, referring to your question, I think that what's uniting these people is fear, anxiety, because of COVID and because of the collapse of the world as we were used to it, and the lack of trust to state authorities. If I may go back, take 2 steps back and look at the situation from a broader perspective, I would agree with the researchers who claim that we deal with populist momentum. Shatalmov, Kasmude, or even Krastev talked about this, and they paid attention to the fact that from time to time there is a momentum, a crisis, which is not only about economy as it was in 2008, but it encompasses both institutions and the value system and the model of functioning of the entire society. And from my perspective, and I will agree with Chantal Mouffe here, this is not a crisis of liberal democracy. It is a crisis of neoliberal democracy. And when I'm saying this, what I mean is not only economy, free market, globalization, and so on and so forth. But what I mean is the social sphere and the sphere of values. For instance, Evairos said that the neoliberal system is a system where the way of thinking about ourselves and about other people is changing, other people around us, the society, the state. It is a system under which we are supposed to be units that are autonomous and responsible for themselves and not for the others. Units that think strategically, that are free, that are not restrained by any restrictions or provisions that are supposed to protect others. Autonomous in terms of extreme individualism, everyone's responsible for their own. When we take this perspective, then those people who are against COVID, against vaccination and so on and so forth, are representatives of the neoliberal way of thinking about reality, under which the state is only a framework that can restrain us, but in fact we are responsible for our well-being, and there's no such thing as society. There is no need for social solidarity. Pluralism is only on the surface. And in this sense, COVID has become a magnifying glass, showing certain already existing tendencies and has amplified them, because the level of fear linked to our personal dangerous situation, the feeling of insecurity, we feel we can be affected. We don't know what the implications will be for our health, for our social security. And at the same time, it is a moment which makes it visible that there are lots of crises, issues, irregularities in the way the state is functioning and its institutions are functioning. So in this situation, COVID is overlapping with a much broader tendency to revalue the world we are living in. And the response to this populist moment or momentum can be very different. Even Krastev warned about the negative consequences mostly, extreme polarization, radicalization, denying social dialogue. But Chantal Mouffe mentions that this is a moment where different groups, different organizations, different social movements all around the globe start to mobilize. And the main element of the conflict or the debate is the question who people are, who the society is, who we are. Us who want to have a say in democracy. And in this sense, we've got people who are anti-vaccination, corona skeptical, and so on and so forth. Some of them even decide about politics of great countries, such as the US. But there are also people who choose to exit, to leave politics, and to no longer be involved. But there are also people who are involved in making a change. And when we have a look at what's going on in Belarus or in South America or in Europe or even in Asia, we can see that there is a huge need to mobilize. And there are huge masses of people who act on behalf of people. They say, we are the people. We want to decide about our future, about our lives. It's not always possible. A couple of minutes ago, there was a piece of information published about the decision of the Constitutional Court in Poland to recognize the fact that the information that the fetus is abnormal and not enough to be able to stop the pregnancy. And this is an example of the fact that today's authorities are not ready for a debate with the society. And in this sense, this populist moment is revealing the real face of the authorities of, for instance, Trump. It is said that there is no political agenda of Trump. He just wants power for his own sake. The Republican Party is at the worst time in its history, and lots of commentators claim that there is no agenda of the Republican Party, there is no program. The only thing that matters for them is to remain in power, and I think that this will not be enough to stay in power. So I think that this is the beginning of a real change that is about to happen and might be healing for democracy. Let me just thank you for this input. I just wanted to ask about today's decision of the Constitutional Court and the so-called women's strike, and to what extent the epidemic situation in Poland, COVID-19, can stop the protests. So to what extent the authorities have used this situation we are in to decide on such important matters right now. Yeah, definitely the authorities and ultra-conservative religious fundamentalists have used the situation we have right now to push those changes. They have proposed them for a long time, and now they have pushed them. And the COVID pandemic restrained the possibility of women to protest, and now it is only possible to mobilize in small groups with social distancing, mostly online, and that's what the handmaids strike look like in Warsaw. There were some car protests, and we deal with the limitation of the chance to act by the civil society, and unfortunately the authorities are abusing this, not only in Poland. Thank you. Alberto Alemanno. He is a professor of law of European Union law and policy at HEC Paris. He's also permanent visiting professor at the College of Europe, Bruges, and the University of Tokyo School of Public Policy. He's an author of more than 40 articles and academic books, for instance, Natural the Law, European Perspective. You wrote about a better society, and to what extent is it possible to have a better society in the times of COVID? Elżbieta Korolczuk said that there is no longer such thing as society. We've got individualism. I'm taking to the street to protest for better tomorrow, but there is no longer a society. What do you think about this?
Thank you for your question, and thank you for having me. Well, most of my work look at organized civil society, but also at social movements that are emerging through digital technologies and organizing through petitions and somehow contributing to this form of atomized engagement by individual group of citizens with policymakers. I wouldn't be so concerned about the possibility of a variety of groups to organize and to engage with policymakers. I think today we need new feedback loops between citizens and elected politicians in order to ensure some forms of responsiveness by the elected to what is happening on the ground. But obviously, COVID renders this functioning much more complicated, and it doesn't really allow these new forms of individually driven forms that I often call citizen lobbies to actually work and to be conducive to a constructive engagement with decision makers. I think what we have been observing so far is a global sanitary crisis that has been fundamentally been tackled by the nation state. And obviously, in these circumstances, civil society and even individuals are not able to identify the target of their anger, the target of their mobilization. Who should they target? If they only focus on the national leaders, they will certainly be missing out because it won't be sufficient to tackle the global nature of the pandemic. So what I would say, based on my own research on the COVID regulatory response by both member states, is that civil society has been fundamentally silenced during the pandemic. There was no possibility during an emergency that policymakers open up their decision-making to what was happening on the ground. However, civil society, individual citizens, group of citizens had different roles to play, useful role, meaningful role that could have been contributing to the adoption of health policies that would have been certainly more legitimate today. Citizens are on the ground, so they could have informed policymakers about the situation happening close to their communities. They couldn't be monitoring the policymakers and the effectiveness of their restrictions on the ground. And finally, also share solutions on how to tackle certain challenges. I would say that the limited inclusion of civil society, the lack of involvement of citizens in the adoption of COVID-19 restrictions has been damaging the legitimacy and therefore the acceptance, the social acceptance of those measures. And this might explain why what many call COVID fatigue in ensuring in the long term the acceptance of new restrictions that by nature need to be adapted over time. At the same time, I would also suggest that civil society itself has not been entirely up to the task. So not only our decision makers were not able to leverage on civil society wisdom, but also civil society by itself was not able to convey in the most convincing, persuasive, meaningful way its own message coming from the ground. We assisted to a major fragmentation of civil society with the reproduction of manifestos, calls for actions, letters by a variety of organizations and groups acting fundamentally in a very narrow way without making an effort at building bridges and coalitions within civil society. We also witness, I would say, what already Elżbieta suggested, an acceleration of structural conditions defining the way in which civil society organizes itself. The fact that the limited capacity of civil society to advocate also emerge. Very little ability of nonprofit organizations, citizen movements to get the ear of the policymakers, partly due to the fragmentation, but also partly due to the lack of effectiveness and strategic understanding on how to connect with the policymakers. Last point, I think we also saw a pretty flawed, limited philanthropic response to the conditions in which civil society and social movements were supposed to act. Several big philanthropic organizations try to come out with emergency funding, but those were extremely cumbersome in terms of timing, and they were not responding to a logic of emergency. And this is something that has already been partly studied by philanthropic experts who have been contributing, including myself, to an analytical study of how this emergency fund have been creating by de facto tarnishing the ability of civil society to act. Final point, we also assisted to a lack of a transnational response. In a way, civil society missed the opportunity to connect the dots across borders in order to show that this was a global crisis in which each and every community had something to connect with, to exchange with, but this wasn't necessarily leveraged on. And this obviously is a missed opportunity because it's very difficult to imagine another global crisis that could have been given rise and paving the way to forms of transnational solidarity that could have been drawing the attention of policymakers and pushing for multilateral coordinated solutions. And that's exactly what we still lack after 9 months of this pandemic we are in.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you, Alberto. And now a question for Jacek Kołtan. He has a PhD in social philosophy and he works at the European Center of Solidarność in Gdańsk. He is interested in everything, I guess. That's what I can say based on his biography. So he's done research on history of the idea of solidarity, on social movements, on the notion of social design and different transformations with regard to the current transformation of an entity. And Alberto was saying that the society was silenced during the pandemic. This is true, but on the other hand, in Belarus, we had protests which started exactly at the time when the pandemic was increasing. So what's your opinion with regard to the protests in Belarus? Do they have anything to do with the pandemic itself? This is my one question. And another question, something that was mentioned by Elżbieta and by Alberto, this transborder idea of protests. How could it be implemented? So could you apply the German methods of social protests in Poland or in France, for example? Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you. All the more so as I have great colleagues with me today, Alberto and Elżbieta. I enjoy reading the papers and they help me to analyze what is going on in the world nowadays. For sure, the pandemic is something that destabilizes the society, and it might be difficult to point out some specific evidence of how the pandemic has destabilized the political situation in Belarus. However, for sure, we can say that the social and political situation in Belarus is subject to change. There is a lot of fluctuation, and there are many factors, especially those that have something to do with life and death, can change things very fast. And the pandemic is a significant crisis of the modernity, maybe the greatest one we've had recently. And in Belarus, this is combined with a long-lasting system of an authoritarian government. And during the last years, we are already able to see that the political system in Belarus was not one that would cope well with crises. And it was very interesting to see how quickly the situation in Belarus changed over 3 weeks. And people understood that it was freedom that was at stake, but also it was their lives that were at stake when they took it to the streets and protested. So it is a fascinating moment. And in Poland, well, it brings back different memories of our own history of Solidarność and the collapse of the communism in 1989. And very often I talk to journalists. Well, they actually approach us and they ask what we can learn from the history of Solidarność. So what are the lessons learned of Solidarność? Whether we have some recipes for Belarus. Well, we don't have any ready recipes for Belarus because it is a different world as compared to 1989. In 1989, it was a different world. We still had socialism and there was this big workers' movement, big factories. So it was quite easy to get people to show solidarity with one another because there were big factories that were not just producing ships or other goods, but also solidarity, because those workers just felt that they belonged together. Now this is already history. Now we do not have such big factories. Does the society still exist? Maybe it doesn't. Of course, we still meet in the streets and we still have the possibility of contacting each other. However, the institutions that created the society as we understood it in the 20th century are now gone. The political parties, for example, can no longer express the views of the society as they did in the past. And also the social classes have been subject to major change. Like, let's look at the middle class. it is disappearing now, and it was so important in the 20th century. And now the farmers, they are now becoming active in a totally different area as compared to what we were used to. So I see that our society is undergoing some major change, and the protests which are taking place in Belarus are a fascinating example, just because they are taking place in such a moment. And also there is a generation conflict in Belarus that is important for these protests. So we've got this young generation of students, of young graduates, and they have a totally different idea of the politics as compared to the political elite in that country. And now I'd like to combine your first question with your second question. So the question about Belarus now during the pandemic, and this question regarding the language of social movements that might become a common language for different countries across borders. I think that at least since 2011, we've been seeing the start of a global language of social protest and social mobilization. We can see that these mobilization forms are becoming more and more similar. Let's take a look at what was happening in Taksim, in Tahrir, in London, the Occupy Wall Street movement, for example. We can see some similarities. And all those people, even though they were so far away from each other in terms of geography, they had a lot in common. They were creating spaces of social autonomy. It started on the internet, and then they took it to the streets. So we had this one space that was the internet, and then the urban space, and they became this common space for protest, social protest. And a lot of common symbols were emerging. In 2011, it was the fox mask that was a symbol of being against the establishment. So people were wearing a mask, and by doing so, they wanted to show the world who they were. In the case of Belarus, it is a song that played a crucial role in the 80s in Poland. Mury by Jacek Kaczmarski, so Walls by Jacek Kaczmarski. So and this song has an interesting history. It was first written against Franco, and then it was also very, very popular in Poland, and now in Belarus. So we can see that it was re-emerging first in Spain, then in Poland, then in Tunisia, after Mohamed Bouazizi burned himself. That song got translated into the local language, and it was sung on the streets there. Then during the Pussy Riot protests, it came up again. So we remember that picture of women being locked in that police car, and they were singing that song, and then it got viral on the internet. And then it turned up again in Belarus, in the Belarusian language. And again, it became another common symbol of all those societies protesting all over the world. So even though the contexts are so different, even though we have all those local elements, and even though the political issues might be different, the people protesting still have a lot in common. So if we can learn something from Belarus, and this is really fascinating, at least for me, I think that lesson is the transformation of the culture that we had in Central Europe in the 80s and the 90s. So a non-violence culture, and it made people gain strength from their weaknesses, because those people understood that they would not be able to fight a regime with all the police forces, with all the military forces. So it was a weakness, but they expressed that weakness in the streets, and that gave them a new identity. It made them visible, and finally they managed to become important social actors. And during the last years, the social movements lacked leadership. There were no strong leaders that would be symbols like Lech Wałęsa in Poland during the Solidarność time, or Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia. So we did not have such leaders of social movements. However, we now have three women who do not want to pursue a political career, but they know that at this particular moment, the key is to symbolize this new social power and to play this game by expressing one's weakness, but also becoming stronger and stronger by doing so. And the role of women in Belarus shows that how modern this social movement is. We have a crisis of manhood, and we've seen it throughout the last decade, and Elżbieta mentioned this too in her initial statement. And now it's women that are taking the floor, and they have a totally different political culture, and this is fascinating. And all these elements should be followed closely when we analyze the protests in Belarus, because they can still create a new language of protest that could be taken over by other regions of the world. We now have a globalized world, so information travels in no time, and any such things can be translated very, very fast.
Thank you. Of course, you can respond immediately, but I would like to suggest the next question, because there is a smooth transition between what Jacek said and Elżbieta Korolczuk. She wrote a book on protests, women's protests, published by the European Solidarity Center. Jacek mentioned that by showing weakness, we can show strength at the same time, and that the role of women is very specific here. The language is different, the role of the manner of protest is different, which can be visible in Belarus. So what about the new protests? Will they be protests of women? Well, to a significant extent, they already are. But well, Margaret Thatcher was also a woman, and Marine Le Pen is also a woman. So So the difference comes from the changes and the culture represented, and not from the features of being a woman. But I was listening very carefully to what Jacek was saying, because the issue of being hierarchical, not leader-like, recognizing one's weakness, but at the same time recognizing one's strength as a society. These things make me optimistic, and it has its continuation. And the philosopher Ewa Majewska wrote great things about this fact in her book, and she tried to combine the history of solidarity with strikes, women's strike, black protest in Poland. When we looked at this from transnational perspective in a book together with Beata Kowalska, Radek Nawojski, Klaudia Stachowska-Gonzalez, and Jennifer Rame, and because the book is co-authored by these people, what we realized was that, well, I don't know if it's about strategy, because it's not only about the form of protest, because definitely in Latin America, for instance, mass mobilizations have very long tradition, and there is no need for us to show them anything. We might learn from women in Argentina, Chile, or Mexico, but it was really interesting that post 2016 cooperation was established by the European Women's Strike and activists in Argentina, and the International Women's Strike was established. And then the 8th of March became a moment where in over 100 countries all over the world, on the very same day, on the 8th of March, the same hour, protests appeared. And this is interesting to me because women, for instance, in Belarus, they symbolize new political culture of protest, which is based on community, solidarity, recognizing one's weakness, but also emphasizing how important common values are. And they emphasize that this is a fight for common values and not only fight for power. And it's also interesting how these women movements all around the world are trying to get back the notion of people, and that's something really interesting. Some people interpret this as left-wing populism, and we mentioned this in our book as a kind of response to right-wing populism, which is not a response of elites. No, it's the response of people who claim you are not the people. You are the elites that are trying to pretend as if you had power. We are at stake here, and we are going to fight for us. In this sense, this is a totally different way of acting, also in terms of emotions. It is not a situation where we are afraid of emotions or where we believe that emotions in politics are dangerous, but we recognize the meaning of emotions, and we build emotional solidarity that is based on rage, on fear about, for instance, our reproductive rights. And we unite not through pure category of interest, but through the category of being a community. And that's what I mentioned at the beginning, this neoliberal hegemony that is diffusing the notion of society that says you are not responsible for anyone, you don't need anyone, and no one needs you. But this is against our experience, particularly now in times of pandemic. We realize that we need state, we need healthcare that is efficient, we need strategies from the government, we need our neighbors, we need someone who will be our friend and will walk our dog while we are in quarantine. We need someone who will share something to eat with us. So pandemic times show us that we need friends. It makes us equal, and I'm not talking about government or elites here, because that's not the case, but in terms of ordinary people and those of us who seem to be privileged, they recognize that our privileged situation to a high extent can result from the fact that our state is functioning properly, or that we have the support of other people around us, or that the social bonds are functioning. And in my opinion, this is the critical question in terms of our future. What definition of people, what definition of us will be successful, will win, will be able to fight for a definition of community that will be pluralistic, based on solidarity and egalitarian, or hopefully not, the version of populism will be successful, that is based on the class division, misogynist, and based on contempt for anyone that's not member of our, so to speak, group. And in this sense, this is a debate over, not over whether we are right-wing or left-wing, whether we are economically liberal or we favor welfare state, but this is a fundamental fight over who we are as a community, whether the community should exist, whether what the relation between the citizens and the state should be, what we need the institutions for, who we are for others. And in this sense, women's movements carry the hope. And I bear in mind the moment where there was a protest of people with disabilities in Warsaw, and activists from women's strikes, my friends, because I'm also involved in those issues, during a couple of dozen of days of protests that took place in the Polish parliament. For over 40 days, activists from women's strike were there in front of the parliament. They mobilized people, they informed the society what was going on. They showed solidarity, they organized 2 big marches. And this is the time where, for me, solidarity is not only a mere word, but it becomes something tangible, something that's an emotion and action at the same time. And maybe that's what we need mostly today. Well, you mentioned that it's interesting what form of people will win. Will you dare to say who will be successful? What form of people will be successful? Well, we talked to Jacek before the meeting that we needed some optimism. And the question is, who is most optimistic? Jacek inspired me. And I think that optimism can be an emotion shared by me as well today. But it's really difficult for me today. Because of the decision, the ruling of the Constitutional Court, who said that abortion on the ground of fetal defects contravened the Constitution. The majority of Poles are not ultra-conservative. They do not buy this ultra-conservative propaganda. In the past years, the attitude of Poles towards immigrants have improved significantly, despite this huge propaganda showing us that anyone who's different than us in terms of ethnicity, physical appearance, language, is a threat to us. Despite this, Poles, both men and women, can say, well, we're okay with this. You can be my neighbor. You can be my co-worker. You are just other human being, the same as I am. So this gives me the impression that the situation might be better, and the vision of politicians in Poland, in the US, and in a range of other states is no longer in line with the attitudes of the society, because the society is becoming more tolerant, more egalitarian, and more prone to have empathy, understanding, tolerance, and cooperation as core values. So I think that the way we feel will be successful. I don't know whether Alberto shares this optimism that has been expressed by Elżbieta Korolczuk. But I've got another question to you. As per the title, we talk about the European culture of protest, but what about protest in the US? What I mean, if we forget about COVID right now, what I mean are the protest against racism after the murder of Mr. Floyd, Black Lives Matter protests. What about this culture of protest, American culture of protest? How to translate this culture, American culture of protest, into the European ground? What is the common denominator between these protests?
Thank you. This is a very difficult question that we can easily summarize as even protesting in the US, it's easier or easier to explain than in Europe. Everything that happens in the United States can be somehow explained in terms of common value system, a common constitutional framework, framework that are known to most of the inhabitants. This is not so immediate in Europe for everything we study. When we study civil society, when we study philanthropy structure, when we study the political system, we don't have a pan-European system for many of those, let's say, systems that are building society. So when it comes to the US, certainly we all have the temptation from Europe to follow the debate, perhaps excessively, to the point of having our own media devoting 30–40% of their time to what is happening in the US political electoral system, because there is an assumption that those political decisions will be affecting us. But certainly this is also true when it comes to the Black Lives Matter revamp that follow the killing of Mr. Floyd, and the way in which that particular awakening of American civil society occurred. I don't think, as a researcher who has been working a lot on US constitutional law and the way in which it can somehow provide a lens for what is happening constitutionally in Europe, that we can draw much of it. Or certainly it is not so immediate. It is not a lens that allows to understand our society. It is not a lens that allows us to compare what is happening here in terms of cultural protest to what is happening in the US. The US protest had certain features that reminded of a civil rights movement 2.0, if I can put it that way, but it also reflected a major polarization of the political system in which the protest itself lent itself to be instrumentalized by political groups into the emergence of movements, niche movements that found some visibility that it would have not occurred otherwise. When you look at the protest culture of Europe, as I was highlighting, there's certainly more fragmentation given by the nation state, but also the lack of an infrastructure that allow countries that are experiencing basically the same dynamic of power. Think of Poland and Hungary. What is happening in Poland, according to many constitutional scholars, is basically following a blueprint that is coming from Hungary. But we know, because we experience it, the difficulty of civil society in Poland to work with the Hungarian groups, even when they belong to the very same organization, be it the Helsinki Committee or Amnesty International or the Open Society Foundation itself. So I think we need to be very humble when looking at the state of European civil society, the way in which we organize, and we could create a political culture of protest that at the moment doesn't really find support from any of the available system. To go and to stick to COVID, there were basically no way for civil society organization to organize themselves across borders. Most of the work that had to be done was really made to talk to national political leaders, despite the fact that the conditions faced by all those groups across Europe were very common. They were really facing similar situations, to the point that virtually everybody was finally looking at the EU as the policymaker, as the privileged level of governance that should have delivered some forms of coordination and security vis-a-vis the demand for safety that citizens have. But this didn't necessarily occur. I would say rather the opposite. The same member states have been boycotting a pan-European answer to the COVID challenges. Every single time the European Commission tried to put forward a proposal to coordinate and to identify common criteria for epidemiological evaluation, for adoption of restrictions, a few member states were against it. They didn't want to see their national prerogative in a situation of emergency to be curtailed by a supranational organization. So this dynamic also is at stake today, even though we can no longer credibly talk about an emergency 9 months after the virus exists and circulate freely within our own country and across borders.
Ja tylko krótko dopytam, bo pan powiedział teraz,
Well,
że
one more question to Alberto, because you were saying now we should have apolitical protests, but don't you think that a protest is always political by itself, by the very notion?
No doubt. I don't know exactly what happened with my translation and how the point has been conveyed. But the point, which was a bit implicit in my critique of the current situation, is the lack of a political electoral space in which many of the challenges faced by European citizens across Europe, from Warsaw to Tampere to Palermo, are mediated through the political space, which is made of political parties that are today saying one thing when they are in the capital, and they're saying another thing when they are in Brussels, taking decisions that are affecting all of us. So this kind of game, which has been going on for long, and which renders the European Union work much less intelligible than what it should be, it is also behind the desire for creating protests that are able to fill up the gap left by the political space, which is incapable to talk the transnational political language aimed at addressing real concerns existing all across Europe for everybody, regardless where they come from. So much of the protest I see occurring or being incipient across Europe is somehow trying to fill such a gap that the European political space as such is not able to produce, nurture, and finally capture and mobilize. And this is a vice of institutional design. Our European political parties are a bunch of national political parties. They are not genuine, they are not authentic, but it's also something that goes beyond the institutional design. There's a clear political will not to come up with political vision of society that exists across borders. Today, we don't even have one political force, the only one being potentially the Greens, that have one vision of society for Europe, regardless of where you come from. And that vision is common. It is presented to all European citizens. In an ideal world, what we would need is to have 5, 6, 7, 8 political parties, from the Christian Democrats to the Social Democrats, presenting such a vision without let's say, obstacle or filter of the nation state, which is making things very complicated when discussing major challenges which are transnational in nature, from global warming all the way to matter of social justice and working conditions across the Union.
I represent a German Green Foundation, so I'm very happy that you are saying that the Greens and women, of course, could save the world. It's just a joke, of course. So, Jacek, what's your opinion? Who could fill this space Alberto Alemanno was talking about? I want to evade answering this question because it's just too difficult. So whoever is able to answer the question should be given the Nobel Prize. Michel Foucault said that the society should be protected, and he was saying this in the 70s, and now it is something that is still applicable. And I read his book later on, and I think that he was very much right, because now we have these movements, post-social movements, who are trying to construct spaces to make the voices of people heard, because it is so difficult to make your voice heard via the classical institutions. So people are coming up with alternatives to make their voices heard. And I think now with COVID in the background, a very interesting situation is emerging. It is a dramatic situation. People are dying, people are suffering. However, some space is opening up that is very tempting I don't want to sound too pathetic, but I would call it space for hope. We were forced to slow down and not to accelerate our activities. It was pressure from above. And now we've been forced to cooperate with each other instead of competing with each other. And also we've been forced to look at the human life and security and safety instead of being focused just on the economic growth and production and making profits. And this is the lesson we are learning now at this particular point in history. And these pathetic words today sound like something obvious when you are trying to describe the problem that we are now facing. So a lot depends on how seriously we take this crisis situation, and whether or not we'll be honest in trying to cooperate with each other so that the reality could really slow down in some areas instead of speeding up all the time. And if we want to create some space for humans to develop, well, we need that very much, but it should be some new space, not something that is profit-driven all the time, not based on increasing our possibilities, our options, our profits all the time. So something interesting is happening when we are confronted with our weaknesses, and now this has been the case. It has been tragic for many people across the world, and I think that this is an important message for us. Those who want to hear this voice, I think, could be those people you were referring to when asking your question. Well, I want to follow your thoughts. What would be the future of social protest in this COVID situation we are facing now? Elżbieta said that COVID could be an equalizer, a social equalizer. So what's your opinion on this? What could be the channel for social protests that are going to continue for sure? I think that our political culture is going to change, and it's going to be a deep change. Because right now we are not creating new political institutions. So many people are very skeptical because there is a protest, and that protest is like an event, a single event, and it does not result in the establishment of new institutions, for example. So very often people refer to some social mobilization instead of social movements, because these movements do not last for long. So it's like waves. A wave comes up and then goes down immediately. But it does not mean that at some deep level, these movements just disappear without any impact, without any traces left after them. And I think that we have limited the boundaries of our imagination in terms of what we think is possible and what we think is not possible, in terms of what we perceive as normal and what we perceive as not normal. And I think the social movements are now a challenge that is showing us that more is actually possible than we thought would be possible. And even though these movements disappear later on, there is some impact, and we are becoming more and more sensitive in terms of social problems. And the main pragmatic and political challenge for now would be to translate these changes to our imagination and our sensitivity into shaping the political institutions. And you may now think that I am speaking a language of the past, because I am saying that we need some political parties still And I am hoping for these social movements to translate into shaping the political parties in a particular way. But maybe in the future, we will not need those political parties at all. Because right now, it is the political parties that are elected, that create the government, and that adopt the legislation. And as long as this is the case, we need to make sure that the imagination and the sensitivity of the social movements, well, they should be translated into the programs of the political parties so that they can later on be translated into the legislation. And that would be a significant step forward. Thank you, Jacek. Alberto, you reacted when Jacek was talking. So what new categories do we need in your opinion? Because Jacek said that he might be still thinking in the old categories. So do you think that now, given the COVID, we need some new categories we did not have in the past?
Yeah, I largely agree with Jacek's analysis about the emergence of a new language of mobilization, new forms of organizing that might be antagonistic to the current ones. And I think we're going to be seeing this emerging: democratic innovation, citizens' assemblies, new forms of organizing the political process that might complement, potentially in the long term, substitute this process. So I'm quite sympathetic, and this is a space in which I've been working a little bit, and there's an incredible, unprecedented vivacity across Europe and beyond when it comes to democratic innovation from the bottom up. At the same time, when we look at these new forms of engagement from the ground, at the moment they are heavily reliant into the transformation of this political demand through the traditional conventional channels of representation. And that's why at the beginning I was referring to the need to creating new feedback loops between these new emerging bottom-up forms of political engagement, which are unconventional and which are much more popular than a representative democracy, with the elected, and those who are capable of basically transforming these instances, not really every 5 years like in the old days, but to be more responsive and to be able to make such a change happen. However, and this is the major point I wanted to raise here, when you look at even the most successful organization movements that have emerged, if you think about Fridays for the Future and Greta Thunberg, who seems to tick all the boxes of increasing awareness in a decentralized, powerless way, because she's not a leader, she denies to be a leader, she hasn't been able to translate this incredible capital of consensus for policy changes that are basically modifying the structure of our economy by decarbonizing it, because not even one policy in any country in the world has been adopted. It occurs exactly the opposite. Also amid COVID, the Paris Agreement tends to be departed from by most of the countries. So how can we translate the legitimate growing demand emerging from social movements that are on the right side of history into policy language, into agenda setting, into the form of constructive translation of new evidence into policy proposals that at some point will really affect the people? And I think this is a methodological challenge, a theoretical challenge, obviously, on how we can accompany that process in order to take full advantage of the positive potential of these social movements and their, I would say, bright future, because we can expect many more of those movements. In the case study of the Yellow Vest coming from France, but not taking off across the border, is a fantastic case study on how you can potentially try to capture institutionally with this citizens' assembly into the political process, with all the reservations we see now, the difficulty of the traditional political process to actually abide by the original promises. Virtually not even one recommendation coming from that citizens' assembly has been followed up by the current French government, what will create a further source of frustration and will render the entire process delegitimated in the eyes of the French citizens. So why should we need citizens' assembly if those are not taken seriously by the conventional political representation occurring in France? Those are very difficult questions to address. How participatory democracy and representative democracy can work together and meet institutionally, theoretically, by giving justice to the notion of representation and at the same time to the concept of participation are pretty much open questions that might be further studied by unpacking the citizens' assemblies that are occurring not only in France, but in many other countries, in particular at the city level, never at the transnational level, which is the most difficult part that in theory should be part of the conference on the future of Europe that has been promised by Ursula von der Leyen when taking power exactly 1 year and a few months ago.
Thank you. Elżbieta wanted to respond. Maybe she has an answer to some of the questions that have been posed. For instance, how to use the potential of the protest groups, how to translate this energy into the political channel. Well, I think that we can deal with three elements here. The first one we focused on is the situation where we've got protests, social movements, innovation, and so on and so forth. At the same time, there is this process of certain decisions, political decisions, being moved away beyond institutions for instance, parliaments and so on and so forth, into the sphere of expert knowledge and institutions that are expert-like, but they are not directly controlled democratically. And we also have to do with the sphere of economy, where decisions are taken mostly under the influence of global corporations that do not report to anyone, to citizens, to the state. The decisions are unclear, no one knows who makes them. We just know that they are made behind closed doors, and we as citizens do not have access to them. And at the same time, there is one more important element. We have to deal with the specialization, so a situation, as Alberto mentioned, where political processes are being decided upon through, for instance, court rulings or some very complicated processes in institutions at the European level, in various committees, various bodies which have certain democratic legitimization, but their activities are not accessible to ordinary citizens or even to NGOs that are active at the level of Brussels or Strasbourg. Also, lots of issues are being decided upon using very complicated court trials. So issues that theoretically should belong to the public sphere and be subject to deliberation, they are decided upon based on very specialist knowledge that we often do not have access to. And for me, what's crucial for the future of democracy is the policy of knowledge, culture of knowledge, and the way how specialist knowledge, experienced knowledge coming from NGOs, citizens, and so on and so forth, how it is treated in the political process. Well, I had the pleasure to be part of a research project dealing with the culture of knowledge, and together with my colleagues we've compared Poland, Sweden and Germany. And in Poland, well, it was not a great surprise for me, but we can talk about the culture of knowledge where the main decisive element is political will. And this is a culture of knowledge that acts on an ad hoc basis. There should be certain processes that will allow to introduce this knowledge, that will allow for public consultation and implementing changes in any area. reproductive technologies or animal rights and so on and so forth. There is no process, and that's something that Alberto paid attention to, and I totally agree with him. There is no process under which there is no institution, intermediary institutions that would allow the knowledge, experience of ordinary citizens to be taken into account in the decision-making process, political decision-making process, and to be taken seriously. So in Germany, for instance, whether a given decision is legitimized or not, whether it is perceived as truly democratic or not, this depends on how many stakeholders took part in the decision-making process, how many representatives of social groups, of organizations that will be somehow, that should have some influence on a given area or will be affected by the implications of the change. In Sweden, in turn, there is this complicated process under which certain issues are being debated, for instance, in the parliament. They are decided upon, and they decide that they need more knowledge, and then a committee is set up to deal with this issue, and some experts are invited to this committee, some politicians as well, but mostly experts from NGOs, for instance. They discuss, they gather knowledge, then they prepare 600 pages of a report. This report is given to the parliament, and then the real debate happens. Once we have knowledge, once we have this knowledge gathered, once we have voices taken into account from various groups, once we have some common reference points that can be taken into account, the debate starts. In Poland, there is this political will, for instance, to change legislation concerning abortion. There are anti-choice organizations that really care about it and want to give their data that is based on not up-to-date knowledge or to research that is non-existing, and this is not being consulted. There is no debate, there is no process under which various stakeholders could be taken into account and their voice could be heard. And we do not talk about the real implications of a given decision for real people, for real women. And the voice of these women is not heard. And I think that this way of undermining legitimacy of democracy, to put it shortly, is to a significant extent a result of the crisis related to knowledge, not only power, but also to knowledge. And this is linked to what we've started with, Joanna, a mobilization of people who do not agree, who do not believe in facts, who are saying, well, maybe vaccinations are working, but my colleague didn't feel well after vaccination, so definitely there's something bad to it. There's a way through which big pharmaceutical companies are trying to abuse me, or so on and so forth. And definitely these people very often, some elements of their worldviews are right. Yeah, definitely. Great corporations want to make great money. That's true. Well, there have been scams, for instance, when it comes to testing medicines. Yes, definitely. There are some interests that might be abused when taking political decision on vaccination. But at the same time, we've got knowledge concerning mistakes made with thalidomide or other tragic situations and instances where medicines turned out to be really harmful, and we know how to eliminate them thanks to procedures, thanks to data, thanks to experts, thanks to our knowledge. And the question is, what we can do with this, because in my opinion, for the future of democracy, our attitude to knowledge, the way this knowledge is being taken account of in political processes. Education concerning knowledge, not only about fake news, but also our attitude towards the world, towards reality, towards data and research, is a critical element that will decide on what type of democracy or lack of democracy we will have in the future. Well, yes, but knowledge is not that loud, is not as loud as the protesting people in the street who are saying that who do not take into account any facts. So who is in charge of the narrative right now, and what is the role of social movements, protesters? We are giving voice to those who are the loudest ones, for instance, farmers in Poland right now, who are blocking streets, or Alberto mentioned yellow vests, or anti-corona protesters, anti-vaxxers who are saying that, well, facts are facts, but we still know better. Who's in charge of the narrative? How can we influence in any way on the way the world is being described? Jacek, would you like to refer to this? Well, let me say that before these people take to streets, there is this long process under which they are not being heard, or they do not find the answer to their questions. So once they take to street, it's too late to change their way of thinking. But before they take to streets, there is this long process, and we can interfere in this process. Well, I think that the narrative is changing very slowly. And when thinking about the topics of today's debate, what came into my mind was a statement of Boris Johnson made at the end of last year. I don't know whether you have heard it or not, but he really said there really is such a thing as society. Well, he was affected by coronavirus, and he, conservative, a direct line from Margaret Thatcher, who said that society is not existing, there are only individuals and families. He said that's not true. He said we needed to change the paradigm of thinking. This hard guy in politics who, with his toughness, his ignorance, impetus, pushed his way throughout the political world. Now it turns out he's a guy who says we need to change our way of thinking about the society. And I'm not saying that this has many implications, but definitely in the political sphere there are such voices, and we might refer to them once necessary. But when listening to Alberto, who was talking about alternative forms of participation in the process of decision making, and Elżbieta Korolczuk, who was saying about the access to knowledge and the role of knowledge, and she was trying to refer to what we are really lacking right now, which is knowledge. I thought about local experiences from Gdańsk, from the times of Paweł Adamowicz, who was the president of the city and 2 years ago was murdered, and who made a very interesting change of the local city level politics. He responded to the needs of the city. He was taking a close look at the issues, the rising numbers of migrants living in Gdańsk and the surroundings. Gdańsk became a very international city. He knew something must be offered to these people for them to feel at home in Gdańsk. And then the model of migrant integration was created. Unfortunately, this was one of few or even the only initiative of this kind. at the city level, but also he was responsible for the model of equal treatment and civil panels, which is really interesting. At a very random way, one of local officers got the idea to knock at the doors of the president and talk to him about the possibilities of modern democracy and to experiment with them at local level to launch these initiatives for the city of Gdańsk. And civil panels were introduced. Randomly, people were selected. Of course, the issue of age and gender played a role there, but these were randomly selected people by computer, some software programs, and these people, several dozen people, met to choose initiatives that would be key in a given year for the development of the city, or initiatives that should be confronted with because they posed a threat for the citizens. And this was really fascinating. I was really stunned that the president, whom I held for a neoliberal and conservative, had a need to experiment with alternative ways of participation in the democratic culture, and this really brought fascinating facts. People were part of the decision-making process, and they made decisions on part of the budget of the city of Gdańsk, of course in cooperation with experts who were available at the time and who supported the decision-making process. But the final voice was at the hands of the citizens. They took the decision, the final decision, what that money was to be spent for. This is just a minor thing, but this shows us very clearly that there are alternative forms of sharing this decision-making process, and there are lots of such alternative forms, and they can, at this micro level, they can be successful, and they are the place where the voice of ordinary citizens can be heard, and social rage does not need to be translated into protest, because it can be released in creative ways of decision making. So I think that the experiment from Gdańsk that took place a couple of years ago and was interrupted by the murder of the president is a very interesting point of reference for thinking about how in a different participatory way the democracy can look like.
Well,
Bardzo dziękuję.
these are almost closing remarks. And just a few minutes are left. Your statements are very interesting, so I think the audience could be even intimidated to ask questions. A very interesting debate. It could go on and on. Alberto, maybe you could try to offer us some forecast for the future, or maybe you could just wrap up the debate by summing up the main points from your perspective.
Thank you. Well, that's a lot of responsibility. It won't be possible to do justice to the richness of the conversation, but I think there is an emerging consensus among us that one of the challenges is to give meaning to this demand for participation that finds expression through different non-institutional channels. And this participation has to find some meaningful content and response through the more conventional political process. In other words, if we get the participation right, we're going to be able to use it as a catalyst for different forms of knowledge to find their way into the political process. But historically, we know that the resistance to these new forms of knowledge to come in came from the technical language, the monopoly that the political class, but also the judicial class had, which are, you know, the second counter-majoritarian institution. Courts are not there to represent the political will of the majority. They are there to control on the exercise of power. But then when Elżbieta is telling me and mentioning the Constitutional Court in Poland, I cannot but highlight the fact that that court is no longer a counter-majoritarian institution. It's a court which is no longer independent. It doesn't have any of the minimum requirements to be considered a court, to the point that courts in other European countries are no longer judicially cooperating with it. They no longer recognize the validity of his own judgment, his own request, when arrest warrants are at stake. So there is an erosion of the rule of law, not only in Poland and in Hungary, as we often hear, in many other countries. And part of the erosion of the rule of law has to do with the lack of participation in the way in which different forms of knowledge have been mobilized over time. So my takeaway of our conversation is really to see how important different forms of knowledge mediated through participation can potentially regain the kind of legitimacy that our institutions are losing today. And this is a matter of urgency, because this is really happening in front of our eyes. And this is rendering us even less powerful, but more powerless when it comes to what we can do and address that question that is basically behind new forms of protest emerging all across Europe. Sorry for not being more optimistic in my analysis, but that's what I see, and that's what makes me suffer and keeps me awake at night.
To nie było do końca optymistyczne, ale mieliśmy
Well,
tutaj...
indeed, it was not very optimistic. However, Anita Baranowska made a comment on Facebook, and she thanked us for being optimistic and for providing positive examples of values. So there were some optimistic elements of our debate after all. And Elżbieta, you are now the last one to take the floor, and then I will just thank everyone and close the debate. Well, the Constitutional Court, absolutely, it is no longer legitimate, and there is a similar problem with the Supreme Court in Poland. So these institutions, they no longer play the role they were supposed to play, and these institutions are not independent anymore, and their power is thus limited, of course. So what could be the reaction of the society to this? When we are looking at this society as a group of individuals, well, we could declare our disobedience, for example. And there are examples for that, like Soro. So we could say that this government is not fair, that what is happening right now is not just. And we could also say that the current government is not compliant with the standards it itself declares to be applicable. And that's why we cannot accept this government as a legitimate one. And this is what the social disobedience is all about. So we have our moral right to use our judgment, to use our conscience, and to make a decision for ourselves whether or not we want to give the power away to the government, because the government has the power because we, the people, have decided it should have it. However, there are certain principles that must be respected, and if they are not, well, it's just no longer applicable, and everyone has to answer themselves this one question: what are the consequences once we establish that this government is not legitimate? Are we going to abide by the legislation this government is adopting because they are not in line with some general principles? But also at the same time, another question emerges: are we ready to accept some kind of sanctions for that? Because if we do not respect the legislation, well, we face the threat of being sanctioned. And of course, we could say that the government has no right to sanction us because we are violating legislation which is not legitimate itself. But sometimes this could still happen, you know. And there are a lot of things we can do in our everyday lives. And I think it will not be the dramatic gestures that will be most important. I think it will be more important to be engaged, to be active on a daily basis, to help the minorities, to help the groups that are being discriminated against, to share our knowledge. So we have to be active every day. We have to show our engagement, because that's what makes the democracy works in real terms. It is very difficult, for sure, but I think that the current government will lose finally. Well, a very nice summary. We are now encouraged to start a revolution, maybe by our individual engagement. So thank you for this debate about the culture of protest in Europe. Alberto Alemanno, Elżbieta Korolczuk, and Jacek Kołtan. Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the audience as well, and see you again in